It'd be an understatement, wouldn't it, to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has changed every facet of our lives. But one thing Australians politicians have, I think, started to realise of late is our over-reliance on imports and our hollowed-out manufacturing base has left us exposed. In short, our almost religious embrace of globalisation and the corresponding abandonment of the concept of self-sufficiency is a strategic mistake, decades in the making, and it needs urgent attention. Well, my next guest is, in some respects, the canary in the coal mine. We should listen. Economist and author Jeff Rubin sheds a little light on what globalisation might mean for the economy in a post-pandemic world. Well, Jeff, you're a leading Canadian economist. You, of course, are the former chief strategist at CIBC World Markets. You're hardly an anti-capitalist, and yet you, when you last spoke to me, said the COVID pandemic has proved that globalisation lets you down when you need it most. Now, I think a lot of people are coming to that conclusion.
That's right, and I think it's a game changer. What it's done is it made the trade policies of Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders all of a sudden look mainstream because, all of a sudden brought a whole new meaning to economic self-sufficiency. Because when you desperately needed vital goods, the only way you could really secure them was not through those far-flung global supply chains, but by producing them yourself.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because COVID's really brought a lot of this home. I mean, I've argued, and I mean no disrespect to the word peace by this, but I've argued we've lived in really a tyranny of peace for a long time. That is, people who are now making decisions for us in the business community, in politics, haven't really had to deal with a massive global conflict of sorts which necessitates the changing of your economy. And so they've got this idea that, well, look, it'll always be peaceful around the world. We don't need to really have a strong manufacturing base at home anymore. We can always rely on just-in-time imports to deliver whatever we choose not to make. But, of course, COVID's proved, hasn't it, Jeff, that those just-in-time imports don't always arrive on time, if at all.
That's right. They're just too late. And let's not also forget that the COVID-19 pandemic falls on the heels of what are probably the greatest trade wars since the Smoot-Hawley tariff of the 1930s. We've seen a huge escalation of tariffs, particularly levied against China, which is the home to not all, but certainly the majority of global supply chains. So this is a pretty devastating 1-2 punch for businesses that rely on cheap labor abroad. Now, that said, it's a hopeful scenario for what I call the expendables, working class people, because we're already starting to see for the first time in a couple of decades in the U.S. manufacturing employment is growing, and so are wages.
It's true, isn't it, Jeff, that a lot of this hasn't happened by chance. You mentioned there now the return of manufacturing in America. A lot of that, I think, is to do with Trump's policies. But prior to that, there had been a gradual decline in Australia, an accelerated decline in manufacturing. It didn't just happen by chance.
Yeah. I mean, not just in Australia, in Canada, in the UK, in France, in any OECD country. And, in his last month in office, President Obama, said these jobs are never going to come back. Well, they were never going to come back under the trade policies that he engineered. But if you change those trade policies, they've come back. And I think, what's really interesting, like on the political front, is how under Donald Trump, the Republican Party has morphed into the party of the American working class. And, I think both Democrats and traditional Republicans have real causes for concern with that.
They call Trump's politics populist, and to a degree Boris Johnson's as well, but is it bad to be populist if what you're really doing at the end of the day is strengthening the base capability of your own economy?
Yeah, populism is a dirty word. in the eyes of the establishment media, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, but I don't think populism has anything to be ashamed of. And as I mentioned to you earlier, I mean, populism can hit from both sides of the plate. And when you actually look at it, the trade policies espoused by, say, a Bernie Sanders, representing the left-wing populist movement in the Democratic Party, were not fundamentally different than the trade policies that Donald Trump was evoked, and they were met with great criticism from the establishment in both the Republican and Democratic Party, which, has been globalist since the day, we've had a continuum of those policies under Bill Clinton, under the Bushes, and under Obama. But now we've had, at least in the last 4 years, a sharp reversal.
It's starting to happen here as well. Your book, which I would recommend for everybody because I think a lot of the salient lessons that might well bear fruit in 2021, your book is titled The Expendables, How the Middle Class Got Screwed by Globalization. Why the middle class in particular?
Well, it's because they used to occupy the jobs that have disappeared. And the jobs that have disappeared were all on sort of the good side of the economy. Like in their heyday, the middle class made the very things they consumed, like cars, refrigerators, TVs. The disappearance of those jobs meant the disappearance of middle class income. So it really has to do with the changing nature of the jobs that our economy is creating, and that has, of course, everything to do with the kind of changes in trade policies that have taken place over the last 3 decades. Changes that, have had the same effect in Australia as they would have in Canada or the U.S. or anywhere in what used to be described as high-wage advanced economies.
Sure. Just finally, Jeff, like all things, globalisation, I think in moderation is a good thing, but you do ask in your final chapter of the book, will the pandemic bury globalisation? Well, here we are now 12 months into COVID. What's the future of globalisation looking like?
I mean, I think it's, as I mentioned, it's all of a sudden made economic self-sufficiency mainstream. It's not just tariffs, but like customers and shareholders themselves are going to be uncomfortable depending on far-flung supply chains, in China where, all of a sudden a plant can be commandeered by the Chinese government, which determines, where that plant can ship goods and where it can't. I mean, I think that's going to leave an indelible impression on people's minds. And I think that that's going to result in a lot of production coming back home. And, perhaps the silver lining is that all of a sudden some of those jobs, some of those middle-class jobs, those good-paying middle-class jobs that we thought were gone forever might just be coming home.
Well, if that's the case, that's a good news story. Always good to talk to you, Jeff. Happy New Year.
You too. Take care. All the best in 2021.